this beautiful morning, this beautiful 1806 church. And we are proud of our history of the first Universalist church in America. Look forward to continuing to create the beloved community today and into the future. There are a few announcements, and we have the announcers right here. So let's start with Kate.
His names are Lucille Amaro, Polly or Pamela Dussesoir, and Karen Watson. Without those women, the project wouldn't have happened. Okay. And I saw myself in the newsletter, with sort of volunteer label on, and I thought, this is not fair. Those folks need to be recognized. Karen lives in Rockport and brought that side of the project into being. Lucille Amaro could go shopping anytime. It didn't matter whose underwear it was for or whose socks, she would go. And Polly got the inventory to perfection. So just wanted you to know these things, and those names will go into our records. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. Lucille.
Thank you. And I'm Lucille LePage, and next week I'm going to have the great privilege and pleasure of directing the Flower Communion service. So some of you, well, I think most of you will remember that, if you have good memories, actually, because we haven't done it for 3 years in person because of COVID. So it's always a very special Sunday, and this year it will be especially special since we haven't been able to do it for so long. So it's a ceremony that symbolizes how each of us brings unique personal gifts to our church community. And together those gifts form what you might call kind of a bouquet, a wonderful bouquet. And each of us takes from the community something a little bit different from what we brought. So next Sunday, please, if you're coming to church, please bring a flower, just one flower, not a bouquet, a flower, or 2 or 3 if you want to provide for people who are not able to bring flowers. Just bring a flower or 2 if you can. We'll put those individual flowers together, and the flowers will form a beautiful and varied bouquet representing our diverse church community. And then before the end of the service, you will each get to choose a different blossom than the one you brought with you. Don't worry if you don't have a garden. Wildflowers are wonderful and welcome. And if you don't have access to any flowers, even from a crack in the pavement, you can bring a picture of a flower, and people can take those home instead of an actual blossom. If you will be joining us online, you also might wish to send a photo this week to me at lepagelucille2@gmail.com. I'll print them out and put them on the table so that people can possibly choose one of your photos to take home with them. So looking forward to seeing you next Sunday. Thank you.
The final announcement, there are many announcements, but I think we've heard enough. Is that better? The celebration of Juneteenth is coming up, and the Cape Ann Museum has many things planned, and it has this wonderful, wonderful exhibit of Doris Prouty's quilts. And if you haven't seen them, they're just glorious. So I recommend that. And with that, I guess we'll have the prelude.
Morning, folks. I'm Art MacDonald, Minister Emeritus in the Essex Church. I'm known to some of you, and it's always a privilege to be here. I saw in Janet's door a wonderful little quote, which probably you're all familiar with, so I'll anticipate you may act on that. Well, a well-behaved church seldom makes history. Isn't that wonderful? So if you get up and storm out at some point, I'll know you're doing your job. And our call to worship, I'd like to do this kind of antiphonally, so you have a role in this. Number 640 in the Gray Hymn Book. .640 in the Gray Hymn Book. What's called the Beatitudes from the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. Sort of an excerpt. Both sets of Beatitudes are longer than this, but I think this gets some of the essence. So maybe I'll begin with the bold print, and your job will be the italicized. Blessed are you poor, the realm of God is yours.
Blessed are you who hunger today, you shall be satisfied.
Blessed are you who weep today, you shall laugh. Blessed are the merciful, they will find mercy.
Blessed are the peacemakers, they will be ranked children of God.
You are the salt of the earth, and if salt becomes tasteless, how is its saltiness to be restored? It is good for nothing, And our first hymn, number 159 in the Gray Hymn Book, This Is My Song, number 159. Thank you, Susan. And now, as Peggy lights our chalice, in your order of service, we have a Unison Affirmation. And so let us together say, in the light of truth and the warmth of love, we gather to seek, to sustain, and to share. Life is a gift for which we are grateful. We gather in community to celebrate the glories and the mysteries of this great gift.
We are also, he says, have a candle for peace. Sorry. Okay. We have a candle that is for peace, and this has been since the start of the war in the Ukraine. And so I will light the candle, and we will keep the candle going until the end of that war.
Thanks, Peggy. Great job. And we have a responsive reading. I think Peggy and I will go back and forth on this one. The words are from Desmond Tutu, who is now deceased, a wonderful peace activist and Anglican bishop from South Africa, who reminds us that indeed peace is a struggle. So, Peggy, I'll start, and you do the italicized. Liberation is costly. Even after the Lord had delivered the Israelites from Egypt, they had to travel through the desert.
They had to bear the responsibilities and difficulties of freedom.
There was starvation and thirst, and they kept complaining.
They complained that their diet was monotonous.
Many of them preferred the days of bondage and the flesh pots of Egypt.
We must remember that liberation is costly. It needs unity.
We must hold hands and refuse to be divided. We must be ready.
Some of us will not see the day of our liberation physically.
But those people will have contributed to the struggle.
Let us be united. Let us be filled with hope. Let us be those who respect one another.
Thanks, Peggy. Our Buddhist friends remind us that if there is to be peace in the world, there must be peace in the nations. If there is to be peace in the nations, there must be peace in the cities. If there is to be peace in the cities, there must be peace between neighbors. If there is to be peace between neighbors, there must be peace in the home. And if there is to be peace in the home, there must be peace in our hearts. And so this morning I offer this prayer that in the midst of the struggles that we go through and at the same time the joys and celebrations of life, that peace begins in the heart and spreads outward. And we peacemakers are to carry that into the world and touch all whom we encounter. Amen. And we'll be quiet for a few moments now, and then Susan will play a musical interlude. Thanks, Susan. That was lovely. I'm going to do a short reading this morning, folks, from a fellow named Stanley Hauerwas, who's a theologian at Duke University Divinity School. If peacemaking as a virtue is intrinsic to the nature of the church, what are we to say of those outside the church? First, I think we must say that it is the task of the church to confront and challenge the false peace of the world, which is too often built on power more than truth. People of faith are prohibited from ever despairing of the peace possible in the world. We know that as God's creatures, we are not naturally violent, nor are our institutions unavoidably violent. As God's people, we have been created for peace. Rather, what we must do is to help the world find the habits of peace, whose absence so often makes violence seem like the only alternative. Peacemaking as a virtue is an act of imagination, built on long habits of the resolution of differences. The great problem in the world is that our imagination has been stilled, since it has not made a practice of confronting wrongs so that violence might be avoided.
Time has come for the offering. Will the ushers or the usher come forward?
So it's great to be here once again, having had the privilege of visiting and preaching a little bit here in Gloucester. It's always wonderful to return. Sorry, about a month ago I was to be here, and my wife and I contracted COVID. It wasn't bad at all, but we needed to stay away, and thankfully Charles Nazarene pinch hit for me. I don't know if Charles is here, but thanks, Charles. or if you're live streaming, thanks. And lo and behold, our friend Elizabeth Ide from Salem was to be here today and contracted COVID this week, and so here I am pinch hitting. I get my shot. I also want to say that this sermon I'm going to give could well provoke some interesting responses. So I think if anyone wants to dialogue afterwards in a group or individually, let's do it. After graduating from college, I served in the U.S. Army Reserve from 1969 to 72, receiving, believe it or not, an honorable discharge 3 years early, being released, so I won't make history, I guess, being released from what was a 6-year commitment to enter a Catholic seminary. The 3 years began with a 6-month active duty term, which I served in Fort Jackson, South Carolina, Columbia, South Carolina. Thankfully, my unit was never activated, though many reservists were, as the Vietnam War was raging. In the last 2.5 years of my service time, I did weekend meetings and summer camps for 2 weeks in various locations. During those 6 months, I had what I later thought of as a kind of mystical experience one day while training exercises with an M16 assault rifle and bayonet. While simulating, we were in hand-to-hand combat. We were in a parking lot with the Viet Cong, we were told, facing us, and our job was to hit that Viet Cong with the butt of our rifle on the side of the head, thus knocking him down, and with our bayonet, we would just thrust it into his chest, and at the same time, yelling at the top of our lungs, "Kill." When we did that in a platoon of 400 soldiers, strangely, I couldn't yell the word. It just didn't come out, as I heard all around me yelling, "Kill." Now, I didn't do this consciously. It's just somehow my voice froze. Upon completing the exercise, I went back to the barracks and wondered, what am I doing here learning to kill? It made me think of Catholic pacifists Dan Berrigan, Dorothy Day, two of my heroes, whom I knew but never read much about what they wrote. So I went off to the base library, remarkably found Dorothy Day's autobiography, The Long Loneliness. After reading it, I thought to myself, if I'm a serious Catholic Christian, maybe I need to be a pacifist, following Dorothy. After 8 weeks of basic training, where I learned to be an expert sharpshooter on the rifle range with this assault weapon, the M16, I advanced to job training as an office clerk and truck driver. During that time, I met 3 draftees. So I enlisted, they were drafted. One a graduate of Harvard, one Princeton, and one Tulane. I was told the Ivy League of the South. They were all very smart college grads from some of the best schools in the world. And here I was from little Catholic college in Rhode Island, Providence College, PC, which we lovingly in those days referred to as practically college, wondering how we became friends. We met every day after work and often talked about the war. All 3 of these draftees were against it, but allowed themselves to be drafted rather than flee to Canada or whatever. They educated me. I mostly listened. With Dorothy Day's thoughts on Catholic pacifism and my 3 friends' analysis of an ill-begotten war, now firmly lodged in my head and heart, I left my 6-month tour of duty an anti-war member of the United States Army. Later, I joined the Veterans for Peace. When I entered seminary a few years later, I did a lot of study on Christian ethics, especially on questions of war and peace. I joined the anti-war movement and participated in marches and demonstrations in Washington, D.C., as my convictions deepened. The debate in Christian ethics was mostly between pacifism, was it required by Christianity, and what has been called the just war theory, which was first articulated in the 4th century and 5th century by a theologian named Augustine. I went back and forth, though I read everything I could by Dorothy Day and Dan Berrigan, two Catholic pacifists, both incarcerated many times for their anti-war activities. Yet I was still intrigued by the just war theory, mainly because I believe, and in my serious perusal of the literature, has always been misunderstood. Many thinking it justifies war rather than prevents it. In my view, on the contrary, if one were to apply its very specific elements to every situation, I would argue it would be almost impossible to justify war. At least that's how I read it. I once asked a serious Catholic ethicist whether or not he thought any of the wars in the 20th or 21st century were just, according to the just war theory. And he said, I'm not sure. Maybe World War II, but none others. Pacifism and just war were closer than many people thought. More recently, the argument between pacifism and just war has been expanded to include a category called just peacemaking. That is, what we are really called to do now is to be peacemakers and social justice advocates, doing all we can to create conditions that will avoid war at all costs. In other words, don't wait till the war begins to choose between pacifism and just war, but work in every way to avoid war to begin with, as so many did in the lead-up to the U.S. invasion of Iraq, which we knew was based on lies. Over these few months, our local North Shore Peace Coalition and our local Veterans for Peace chapter have had lively, somewhat contentious debates about this current tragic war in Ukraine. Some of the debate has been about why the war was started and who's most at fault. But another key debate point has been around the role of the United States and NATO, this mostly European coalition, but heavily funded and probably directed by the United States, founded after World War II to defend member nations. Most, though not all, in our two groups sharply condemn Russia and President Putin for initiating this horrendous war, and more recently for war crimes targeting civilians and hospitals even. But a minority in our two groups blame the US and NATO for continuing to expand over the decades, thus threatening and, as one person said, provoking Russia, most especially since the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. To me, ethically speaking, the most challenging part of the debate in the two groups has to do with US and NATO countries, which of course Ukraine's not part of, supplying massive amounts of weapons to the Ukrainians. Some argue this only escalates the conflict and will lead to a stalemate and ongoing deaths, likely very true. Others argue that without these weapons, Ukrainians would be slaughtered. Of course, all of us agree we prefer negotiations and an immediate ceasefire. Ukrainian President Zelensky has at times called for something like that. President Putin, I'm not so sure that he's quite there yet. Despite ongoing dialogues with leaders from Germany, France, Israel, and Turkey, I would love to have been part of those discussions and find out what was being said. In an op-ed piece not long ago in the Globe, written by an Afghani, the writer opined it was a total mistake to arm Ukraine, arguing it will only lead to endless bloodshed and likely standoff, just like what happened in Afghanistan. He pleaded for stronger attempts at negotiation. And who could disagree with that sentiment? In a recent dinner with friends, we all pondered, what would Gandhi do? I reminded folks that Gandhi many times said the only thing worse than a resort to violence was cowardice. A few months ago during Holy Week and Passover and Easter, I wondered, what would Jesus do? One dinner participant wondered if the Ukrainians should not resist, thus avoiding a bloodbath. He reasoned, they're going to lose anyway. That now is not so clear, as the Ukrainians chose to defend their country with the help of these massive transfer of weapons. Yet many have died, and devastation is horrific, with no end in sight. And recently, if you've read, Russian superior firepower maybe or probably is beginning to take advantage. When we were celebrating Passover and Holy Week, the Last Supper, Jesus with his friends, Good Friday, the brutal crucifixion, and Easter Sunday, the resurrection of Jesus, and then afterwards this slow and painful separation within the Jewish community between the traditional Jewish community and the Jesus Jews. And after reading the Beatitudes, once again, I'm reminded that Jesus that I was introduced to in my early years was a very kind, a gentle, a peace-loving Jesus, a storyteller and a healer, unjustly charged and executed. But when I got to seminary and studied more seriously the Gospels and the life as best we know about Jesus, I became a little more aware that Jesus could be pretty confrontational. In your face at times, if you were part of the temple hierarchy or the Roman government, such as Herod. They oppressed the poor and marginalized, whose hero was Jesus. Jesus became hated by these religious and secular leaders, and he was executed by the state as an agitator. And yes, he did make history. Jesus had a gentle, loving side with children and the poor, but he had no patience with corruption and oppressive behavior and confronted it directly. The scene in the temple where he overthrew the tables and condemned the money changers was a clear indication of his own inclination to speak truth to power. He was a threat. The Romans understood this, as did the Jewish clerical hierarchy. His execution was political, as he challenged the structures of power in his day. The Romans knew this, and that's why they put on the cross above his head, Jesus Christ, King of the Jews. Back to Ukraine. One of the public intellectuals of our day, and a friend who has preached in the Essex Church, retired Colonel and Vietnam vet Andrew Basevich, now head of the Quincy Institute. Although he has sharply condemned Russia's invasion and has acknowledged the war crimes of Putin's army, he's also laid blame on this situation on the United States and NATO. NATO agreed not to expand after the Soviet Union collapsed, and they have reneged on that promise, he reminds. With President Gorbachev, there was a clear opening to develop a different kind of relationship with Russia and to work with peaceful coexistence, maybe, despite differences. but our policies betrayed that possibility, and we must accept responsibility for what has happened. He concludes. In one of his books, The Limits of Power, The End of American Exceptionalism, Bacevich, who lost a son in the war in Iraq, a war he completely disagreed with and begged his son not to go into, he shares views on how the U.S. should engage in international politics. Bacevich is a serious Catholic, and he begins by quoting the Old Testament, the book of Kings, when the prophet Isaiah says to King Hezekiah, as he is preparing to die, Hezekiah that is, Hezekiah, set thine own house in order. Bacevich's hero in the 20th century United States is a Christian theologian and ethicist named Reinhold Niebuhr, who, though a pastor and seminary professor, actually served as a consultant to a number of presidents about U.S. foreign policy. Niebuhr described his ethical thinking as Christian realism. Niebuhr was clear-eyed and a prophet in his honesty about the human condition and had few illusions about the nature of humankind, suggests Bacevich. And look what's happened in the last 120 years, he goes on. How many wars? How many stockpiles of nuclear weapons do we have? What about Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan? And I quote, realism and humility form the core of Niebuhr's worldview, each infused with a deeply felt Christian sensibility, reminds Bacevich. Realism implies an obligation to see the world exactly as it is. And humility imposes an obligation for Americans to see themselves without blinders. The enemy of realism, he says, is hubris. The enemy of humility is sanctimony. That we know best and our values are somehow exceptional. Two concrete realities come to mind that make his point. One, we're justifiably calling out Russia and President Putin for war crimes, and that he should be tried in the International Criminal Court eventually. Yet, neither Russia nor the U.S. recognize the International Criminal Court, have not submitted to it. Secondly, we've condemned Russia, as we should, for using horrendous, devastating weapons called cluster munitions, which burst open and spread over a wide area. Many countries have signed a treaty banning cluster munitions. Neither Russia nor the United States has signed on. The prophet Isaiah's words ring in our ears, set thine own house in order. So is it ethical for us to be transferring weapons to the Ukrainians? I keep asking. Will it only lead to endless bloodletting? Or do they have a right to defend themselves as they've chosen? And it is only right for us to be helping them. I find myself in the camp of saying they have made their choice not to surrender in the face of this unjust attack. And ironically, though many, even the Pope, have argued that the just war theory has no longer any usefulness, there is no such thing as a just war, says Francis, I find myself invoking the just war theory in defense of sending weapons to Ukraine. It's a defensive war. They didn't start, and they don't have any resort but to defend themselves. Sadly, tragically, knowing it will lead to more bloodshed, I still think it's ethical to help them defend themselves and their land, knowing there's no end in sight, yet praying every day for a ceasefire and serious negotiations. And I must ask, have we negotiated seriously enough for a ceasefire? Honest negotiations? I'm not convinced. Could we be talking more, seeking some middle ground, if such exists. But ultimately, I am convinced we are called beyond this pacifist just war debate to become just peacemakers, committed to ensuring, as best we're able, that no such wars ever happen again, however utopian that may seem. So in these last years, I've become ever more active with Veterans for Peace local chapter. And I've joined the Massachusetts Peace Action, which has lobbied to reinstate arms control measures abandoned by the former president, and lobbied to cut 10% from the defense budget and direct that money to human needs. With realism and humility, we are called to say together, I believe, no to war as a solution to our disagreements. As I look back on my time in the Army, ironically, which serve as the beginning of my own serious ethical reflections on issues of war and peace, and express gratitude, actually, for that time, as unpleasant as it was. I am grateful for my mystical experience of going silent as others yelled, "Kill!" and ever so grateful for my friends George, Harvard, Harry, Princeton, and Terrio, Tulane, 3 Ivy Leaguers who took this practically college graduate under their wings and helped me understand the importance of resisting any and all calls for war. In the words of the Beatitudes of Jesus, both from Matthew's Gospel, chapter 5, more gentle and mild version, I would say, but also read chapter 6 of Luke for a different version of the Beatitudes, somewhat, much sharper, a much more harsh version in which he talks about the woes for those who have done evil. I pray we all may have the courage to speak truth to power when the need arises. I pray we may truly experience liberation, as Desmond Tutu speaks of, from oppression and all forms of slavery. And finally, I pray we all may experience resurrection and transformation of our lives. And may peace come to our lives and our world as we commit together to becoming just peacemakers, making these Beatitudes more central in our lives. And our Unison Prayer is number 514 in the Gray Hymn Book. Number 514. And let us together say, God, lover of us all, most Holy One, help us to respond to you, to create what you want for us here on earth. Give us today enough for our needs. Forgive our weak and deliberate offenses, just as we must forgive others when they hurt us. Help us to resist evil and do what is good, for we are yours, endowed with your power to make our world whole. And our closing hymn is number 163 in the Gray Hymn Books. peace which passeth understanding, the peace of God, which the world can neither give nor take away, be among us and abide in our hearts. So let it be. Amen. And as Peggy extinguishes our chalice, in your order of service, if we could recite together. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. Amen.
Thank you, Susan.